There's a specific kind of paralysis that hits people in their 40s and 50s when they think about their finances. It's not the same as being scared. It's more like standing at the edge of a swimming pool that you know you should jump into, but instead of diving, you just stand there. And the longer you stand there, the harder it gets. Not because the pool got deeper, because the story in your head about how long you've been standing there got louder. You know you're behind. You know you should have started earlier. You know that every year you wait costs you something. And somehow, knowing all of that makes it harder to start, not easier. That's not a logical response, but it's a completely human one. And there's a very specific psychological reason it happens, one that nobody in the personal finance world talks about enough. It's called the sunk cost fallacy, and most people have heard of it in the context of bad investments or failed relationships. The classic version is, you keep throwing money at something that isn't working because you've already put so much in. But there's a less discussed version that plays out in reverse. Instead of continuing something because of what you've already invested, you avoid starting something because of what you've already lost. The years you didn't save, the decade you weren't investing, the compound growth that was available and went uncaptured. You're not paralyzed by what you have. You're paralyzed by what you didn't do. And that paralysis is costing you compounding time that is still very much available. Here's what I want you to understand clearly. The feeling that it's too late is not an assessment of your actual situation. It's a grief response. When you look at your finances and feel that crushing combination of regret and resignation, that's not your brain calculating the math and finding it doesn't add up. That's your brain processing loss. The loss of time, the loss of earlier options, the loss of the version of yourself who did the thing you now wish you'd done. Grief is real, and it deserves to be acknowledged. But grief is also not a financial planning tool. And when it's driving your decisions, or more accurately, your non-decisions, it's actively working against you. Now, here's the thing about the conventional financial advice around starting late. It almost always does one of two things, and both of them make the problem worse. The first approach is the panic play. It shows you the compound interest chart, calculates how much you've lost by not starting at 25, and presents the damage in the most alarming terms possible. The idea is to scare you into action. But what actually happens is the opposite. You look at the chart, you feel the full weight of the gap, and the grief response activates even harder. You don't feel motivated, you feel defeated. The advice designed to help you start makes you want to close the tab. The second approach is toxic positivity. It tells you it's never too late, you've totally got this, small steps add up, believe in yourself. And while none of that is technically wrong, it glosses over the real psychological weight of the situation in a way that doesn't actually move anyone. Because the person standing at the edge of the pool doesn't need cheerleading. They need an honest conversation about why the pool is worth jumping into despite how long they've been standing there. So let me try to have that conversation. First, the math. Not the alarming version, the honest version. Yes, compound interest is more powerful at 25 than at 45. That's real. But here's what the panic charts don't tell you. A 45-year-old investing consistently for 20 years still benefits from 20 years of compound growth. 20 years is not nothing. It's not ideal. But ideal is gone. The question now is whether you're going to get those 20 years or whether you're going to spend them standing at the edge of the pool feeling bad about the previous 20. And here's something the standard narrative really gets wrong. Most people in their 40s and 50s are not starting from zero, even if it feels that way. They have more income than they had at 25. They have more clarity about what they actually want their life to look like. They have more capacity to increase their savings rate meaningfully. Not because they're better with money, but because their expenses have often stabilized in ways they hadn't when they were younger. The person starting at 45 isn't the same person who would have started at 25. They're a different investor with different advantages. There's also a financial concept called catch-up contributions that most people in this situation don't fully use. In the United States, once you turn 50, the IRS allows you to contribute significantly more to tax-advantaged retirement accounts than younger savers can. The system actually acknowledges that later starters exist and built in a structural accommodation. Most people who would benefit from this don't know it exists, or know it intellectually and haven't used it. Now let me address the psychological piece more directly, because the math alone doesn't move people. What moves people is changing the story. The story most people are telling themselves when they feel stuck is a version of this: I failed to do the thing I should have done, and now it's too late to matter. That story feels like a realistic assessment. It isn't. It's a narrative your brain constructed to explain a complicated emotional experience. The experience of looking at a gap between where you are and where you thought you'd be. And narratives, unlike math, can be changed. Here's the alternative story. Not the optimistic spin version, the accurate version. You made the decisions you made with the information, capacity, and circumstances you had at the time. Those decisions have consequences that are real and can't be undone. But the window in front of you is still open. You have more years of earning and saving ahead of you than you're giving yourself credit for. And the decisions you make in those years will compound. Not as dramatically as they would have compounded at 25, but meaningfully. There's a concept in psychology called temporal discounting, the tendency to undervalue future rewards compared to present ones. We've talked about this on this channel before, but it cuts in both directions. Not only do people discount the future value of saving now, they also discount the future value of starting now rather than waiting. Every month you spend standing at the edge of the pool is a month of compounding that doesn't happen. Not a month that was already lost. A new month. Being lost right now, in real time. The enemy isn't your past. The enemy is the story about your past that keeps you from acting in your present. So here's what I'd suggest, and this is specific rather than general. First, separate the grief from the planning. You're allowed to feel the weight of the time that passed. That's a real loss, and minimizing it doesn't help. But consciously set it aside when you sit down to actually look at the numbers. Grief belongs in a different part of the conversation than planning does. They don't do well in the same room at the same time. Second, start from where you actually are, not from where you think you should be. Open the account, look at the number, whatever it is, and treat that number as your actual starting point. Not a symbol of everything you didn't do, just a number. A starting point. Because it is. Third, find the catch-up lever that applies to your situation. If you're in the U.S. and over 50, look at your 401k and IRA contribution limits right now. Not eventually. Now. Because this is exactly the kind of useful specific action that gets buried under the emotional weight of feeling behind. And it's one of the most direct ways to close the gap more quickly than the standard narrative suggests is possible. Here's the honest truth I want to leave you with. Nobody who is in their 40s or 50s and hasn't saved enough is going to read a chart and suddenly feel fine about it. The feeling of being behind is real. The regret is real. None of that gets argued away. But the conclusion that it's too late, that conclusion is not real. It's a story. A convincing one, built from real emotions, but still a story. You can acknowledge the loss and still make the decision to start. Those aren't contradictory. In fact, I'd argue that the most financially courageous thing a person can do isn't to start young when it's easy and obvious, and all the charts are pointing the same direction. It's to start late, knowing the full weight of what was missed, and do it anyway. Because that requires something more than math. It requires deciding that the future is worth building even when the past is complicated. Start this week. Not because it's not too late. It's not too late. But that's not the reason. Start because every week you don't is a week of compounding that still belongs to you, and you keep giving it away. If this reframed something that's been sitting heavy, subscribe. Every week we work through the psychology behind why money feels the way it feels and what you can actually do about it. And drop a comment. What's been the hardest part of getting started or restarting with your finances? I'd genuinely like to hear it.